Today, we are going to talk about the carbohydrates in detail. Do you have to cut out all the carbs to lose the weight? The answer is a little more complicated than that, and we are going to get right into it. So, welcome back, friends, to another episode of the channel Wealthy Health. So, carbohydrates are actually chains of glucose, and low carb diets have become very popular, including the diet such as the keto diet, which has been very successful for people to lose the weight. However, like many traditional societies throughout the ages have eaten carbohydrates, and there hasn't been a lot of obesity until relatively recently. So, what's the difference? What's the truth? We had populations that ate a lot of rice, and we had populations that eat a lot of potatoes, and there was no difference between the two. So what's the difference? We had populations that ate a lot of rice, and we had populations that eat a lot of potatoes, and there was not much obesity until the 70s. There's actually like many different kinds of carbohydrates, and not of all of them are really all that fattening. So I'll break them down into 4 categories. So the first one is the refined carbohydrates. The second one is the unrefined carbohydrates, which are mostly the starchy ones. The third one is also the unrefined carbohydrates that are more fibrous. The fourth one, and that I'll use a separate category, that is fruit. So I will be discussing each one of them in turns. So the first one is refined carbohydrates. So these are actually the processed, that is, they're not found in the natural form in nature. So the classic would be the white flour, or the example, or even the whole wheat flour. You don't need a flour trees, but you do grow wheat berries, and from that we have to process that in order to get the flour. So it's not you have to process that in order to get the flour. So it's not really just the type of food, but what you're doing to the food that makes it more fattening than other foods. So what you do when you take the wheat berries and turn it into flour is that you have to extract a lot of proteins out. You have to take out a lot of fiber, and you take out all of the fat, and then you grind it into the very fine dust, and that's how you get the white flour. And because it's been very highly refined, the body actually absorbs it very quickly, especially the grinding it into that fine dust. So we get that very quick rush of the glucose because the carbohydrates are made of chains of glucose. And the insulin eyes also, it actually causes a spike up very quickly, and it can sometimes fall just as quickly, which can lead to the crash that happens perhaps an hour and a half, or after eating high carbohydrates contained in the meals. These refined carbohydrates are the main things that people suggest that you cut out in a low carbohydrate diet. So some examples of these refined carbohydrates is flour. So the white flour, but also the whole wheat flour. Even though it contains a little bit more fiber, it's also still ground up very fine, which leads to the very quick absorption. So the other things like rice flours and corn flours are also highly processed. So all the things that are predominantly made out of these flours should be avoided if you want to avoid the very high rising of glucose, spike in insulin, which may lead to the weight gain. So some of the examples that would be like things like bread, pasta, cereals, breakfast cereals, beer, muffins, donuts, and that kind of thing. And most of the people I know actually acknowledge that they are not particularly slimming foods. Okay. So the other group that's particularly problematic is refined simple sugars. So sugars like the table sugar is actually composed of one molecule of glucose and one molecule of fructose, as opposed to starches, which are mostly chains of glucose. And it's this fructose which is particularly problematic for the weight gain. So it's in the way that the fructose is metabolized. It actually goes straight to the liver and often becomes converted into fat, which can lead to a lot of insulin resistance, which leads to the high insulin levels. So the problem with sugar is not only that it's very easy to turn into fat, but it's also very rewarding. That means it's very easy to eat sugar, it's very easy to overeat sugar, and this is a problem when you have added sugars. So there's lots of natural food that contains sugar, but there's usually a limit to how much sugar they contain. So processed foods are particularly very bad because they add a lot of sugar, because it's a way to make the food taste very good at a very low cost. So avoiding these kind of sugar and other things with a lot of fructose, like high fructose corn syrup, for example, is very critical for weight loss. So that actually includes the white sugar, brown sugar, because they have things like fructose, the high fructose corn syrup, maple syrup, fruit juice concentrates, then that kind of things. So there's a lot of different names because they often want to hide how much sugar is contained in ingredient list. You really have to go digging. So another area to look out for are refined grains, because while these are not as refined as flour, which have been ground very finely, they are still refined. So things like white rice, instant rice, polished rice, instant oatmeal, because again it's ground very fine so that it cooks very quickly. So that is much more processed than steel cut oats, for example, which have to be cooked for a long time. So cornstarch, potato starch, modified food starch, tapioca starch. You want to avoid all these kinds of things. So altogether, those are like flours, refined grains, and grains and starches, and simple sugar should be avoided. So the next group of carbohydrates are the unrefined carbohydrates, which means that these occur fairly close to what they look like in nature, but these are the unrefined carbohydrates that are starchy. So usually you will find them in roots that are growing underground, because the plants are actually trying to store away these carbohydrates for later use. So this includes grains like rye, barley, buckwheat, spelt, basmati rice, the black rice. And even certain noodles are also made of yam and root vegetables like the potatoes, sweet potatoes, parsnips, taro, artichoke, for example. So those are all the starchy carbohydrates, but because they are unrefined, they do contain things such as the fiber, which helps slow down the digestion. So you don't get that very quick rise in glucose that you see with the refined carbohydrates. So indices such as the glycemic index, what you see is that the glycemic index is much more lower than those of the refined carbohydrates, and therefore you can actually take the food in moderation. So they are not necessarily bad for you. It actually depends on how you make them, and also how you take and how often you eat them. But that they are often much better choice than the refined carbohydrates. So the third group of carbohydrates that you should be cautious of, but not necessarily completely cut out, is the fruit. So fruit is very controversial because it is a natural food, however. But some fruits have a lot of fructose, and chemically, so there's no difference between the fructose that is contained in the glycemic index and the glycemic index. So the glycemic index is contained in fruit and the fructose that you would get in high fructose corn syrup. So the difference with fruit is that it comes packaged with a lot of other things. Like when you eat an apple, there's a lot of fiber because there's a lot of the pulp. There's other nutrients in it, and it's actually often very hard due to the bulk of the fruit. And to eat these fruits are opposed to overeating things like the fruit juice, for example, where all that has been removed. So certain fruits are going to be much better than the others. So fruits like berries, strawberries, raspberries, blackberries are often actually going to be with a much better than the other very sweet fruits. So the other thing to keep in mind is that many of the fruits that we eat today are different than the fruits that we ate 30 or 40 years ago, because they are much sweeter now. They have been genetically altered. So they've been bred together. So a lot of things like the white peaches, the golden berries, the golden berries, the pineapples have been bred to much sweeter than the previous generations. And that's why it's not so hard to get people to eat these fruit these days, because it really isn't nature's candy. So if you're going to take fruit, while it's not the worst thing that you can take, it can be one of the factors that impeding your weight loss. So that takes us to the last category of carbohydrates, which is really what should make up the bulk of the carbohydrates in your diet. And these are unrefined carbohydrates, but non-starchy and more fibrous. So these are actually usually the vegetables that grow above ground, as opposed to the starchy ones that grow below the ground. So these occur naturally, but so these occur naturally because of the amount of fiber in them. So they're very bulky, and they tend to make you feel full when you have it, and they're very slowly absorbed, so you feel like you're eating a lot of food. So if you slow rise in blood glucose and insulin, and therefore it may actually make it easier to keep that weight off. So legumes and lentils are a very great examples of these carbohydrates that really don't have much of an effect on insulin. And they even contain a lot of protein, so they are actually good vegetable source of protein. Even there sometimes can be added with natural fats, and there's a ton of fiber in these, which means that it's going to slow down the rise of glucose because absorption is much more slower. So the other big category that you'll see here are the non-root vegetables. So the things like asparagus and peppers and broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts, eggplants, leafy greens, all of these things. So while they're carbohydrates, nobody really gets fat eating broccoli. If it's just very difficult to get fat from vegetables. If you're eating a lot of these above ground vegetables, it's going to provide a lot of nutrients. But it's also going to fill you up because of their bulk, and as long as you're not eating frequently, then it's going to do a very good job for weight loss. So the general consensus is that these vegetables are not particularly fattening, and this doesn't matter if you're listening to the low fat diet or the keto diet or the paleo diet or any standard diet. So most people acknowledge that these leafy greens and the beans are on the great parts of your weight loss diet. So carbohydrates are not one category, but really all different categories. And some carbohydrates can be a part of a great weight loss strategy. So remember, like refined carbohydrates, maybe you should hold out for a bit longer if you don't want to lose the weight off. So I'll give it a red light. And for starchy carbohydrates, the root vegetables, and also for the fruit, I'll say a yellow light. Be cautious of these. You might also be able to tolerate it, but you might not be tolerating it. And the green lights for virtually all diets are the unrefined non-starchy carbohydrates. Things such as the legumes, lentils, and leafy green vegetables that grow above the ground. So this is all for today, and thanks for watching, and I hope this video is very useful and it helps you have, if you want to lose your weight or something, you can actually go through this video. You'll come to know about the different kinds of carbohydrates are there, and which are the ones we should avoid and which are the ones we should take in as a part of the weight loss diet. So please do share it with all your family and friends, and please do subscribe to this channel. So till I come up with a new video, everyone take care, bye bye, and have a healthy life.